Imagine a plane of consciousness that exists beyond what we see and touch, a realm where the ordinary rules of time and space no longer confine our awareness. This is the fourth dimensional consciousness, a state where the mind transcends the physical, and the spirit begins to perceive reality from a higher perspective. It is not about changing the world outside, but transforming the world within, understanding that every thought, every feeling, and every moment of awareness carries a deeper significance than the senses alone can grasp. In this dimension, the illusion of separation fades, revealing the essential unity of all life. The walls that divide you from others dissolve, and you perceive the subtle, invisible threads that connect every being. In this awareness, ego-centered thinking loses its power, and a profound sense of oneness emerges. It is here that we recognize that harmony and peace are not distant goals but inherent qualities of consciousness itself. Accessing this realm requires a shift from reliance on outward circumstances to reliance on inner presence. Thoughts are no longer mere mental chatter, they become instruments of creation. When consciousness is aligned with truth and spirit, every thought can manifest harmony, love, and understanding. The fourth dimension teaches us that reality is shaped not by struggle or effort alone, but by the clarity and purity of awareness we bring to each moment. Yet to enter this space we must release the chains of limiting beliefs, those habitual fears, attachments, and illusions that keep us tethered to the three-dimensional world. These are the mental constructs that suggest we are separate, powerless, or confined. When these dissolve, the mind opens, and the heart awakens to its infinite capacity for peace, creativity, and freedom. In this higher consciousness, freedom is not the freedom to act without constraint, but the freedom to exist fully in alignment with the eternal. Anxiety, doubt, and conflict no longer dictate our experience, for the soul has recognized its true home, a state beyond time, beyond struggle, beyond the physical limitations of form. The fourth dimension is a realm of pure awareness, where life is experienced from a perspective of infinite possibility and profound serenity. To dwell in this consciousness is to live in a constant state of awakening. It is a reminder that the true power of life lies not in what we accumulate, control, or achieve outwardly, but in the depth of awareness we cultivate within. Here, the spiritual and the practical coexist seamlessly, and each moment becomes an opportunity to experience the boundless richness of life. It is not a distant destination, but a living reality available to anyone willing to see beyond the surface and embrace the consciousness that transcends time and space. The concept of moving beyond the physical realm involves transcending the limitations imposed by the three-dimensional world we inhabit. In the ordinary experience, we are conditioned to interpret life primarily through what we see, hear, touch, taste, and smell. These senses define the boundaries of reality as a series of tangible events and objects, and they keep the mind focused on the external material world. Yet there exists a dimension of consciousness where perception is no longer bound by physical forms or temporal sequences. In this realm, reality is experienced more as a field of awareness than as a collection of separate objects. It is not that the physical world disappears, rather, it is seen in its true context, as one expression among many within a larger spiritual framework. Awareness in this dimension recognizes that the substance of life is not merely matter but consciousness itself, flowing, infinite, and eternal. In this state, the mind begins to perceive patterns, connections, and energies that are invisible to the ordinary senses. What appears to be random or disconnected in the three-dimensional perspective is understood as harmonious and meaningful when viewed from this higher plane. The limitations of space and time are no longer rigid, and the experience of existence becomes more fluid, expansive, and multidimensional. Here, thought itself gains a new power, because it is seen as an active force shaping reality rather than as a passive reaction to external circumstances. Awareness shifts from reaction to observation and creation, where the inner life becomes the source of transformation. Individuals learning to dwell in this consciousness realize that the outer world is often a reflection of inner states, and the key to true freedom is cultivating clarity, purity, and alignment within. In this realm, the focus moves from seeking fulfillment through objects, achievements, or external validation to discovering the richness, peace, and abundance inherent in the inner life. Sensory limitations no longer dictate understanding, and the mind begins to operate from intuition, insight, and spiritual perception. The experience of time stretches and contracts, allowing moments to be perceived in their depth rather than as fleeting points, and the sense of separation between self and others diminishes as one perceives the unity underlying all existence. Life is understood less as a series of isolated events and more as a continuous, interconnected flow of being, where consciousness itself is the fundamental reality, and every encounter, thought, or action is part of the infinite unfolding of life. Unity and oneness in consciousness is the profound recognition that all life, all existence, is interconnected, and that the sense of separation we experience in everyday life is largely an illusion created by the mind. In the ordinary three-dimensional perspective, we see ourselves as isolated individuals navigating a world of other separate beings and objects, each competing, struggling, and existing independently. Yet when consciousness expands into higher dimensions, the perception shifts, revealing that the divisions between self and other, mind and body, life and environment are superficial and temporary. Everything is part of an inseparable whole, and every thought, action, and emotion resonates within this interconnected field. In this awareness, the ego, which thrives on separation and individuality, begins to lose its dominance and a sense of harmony emerges. Life is no longer perceived as a collection of isolated events but as a continuous, flowing pattern in which every part supports and influences every other part. This recognition brings a profound transformation in how one relates to the world. Acts of kindness, compassion, and understanding are no longer simply moral choices but natural expressions of one's awareness of interconnectedness. The problems and conflicts that arise in the three-dimensional perspective are often seen in a new light, understood as reflections of an incomplete awareness of unity rather than as absolute divisions. The awareness of oneness also affects the way one perceives personal challenges, as they are no longer experienced as separate or overwhelming occurrences but as opportunities to align more fully with the universal harmony that permeates life. In this consciousness, there is a deep sense of belonging and intimacy with all beings and with the universe itself. Silence, meditation, and stillness become pathways to experience this reality directly, as they allow the mind to quiet its distinctions and tune into the underlying unity. Relationships are experienced less as attachments or dependencies and more as expressions of the shared life force that flows through all. The awareness of oneness also fosters creativity, intuition, and insight because the mind begins to operate from the understanding that all ideas, inspirations, and solutions arise from a universal source rather than from a limited, individual self. As this consciousness deepens, it becomes evident that unity is not merely a philosophical concept or a spiritual ideal, but a living, dynamic reality that can be experienced in every moment, every interaction, and every act of perception, revealing that the sense of separation is optional, and that the natural state of life is harmony, interconnection, and flow. Conscious awareness of spirit is the profound awakening to a reality that transcends the material and the visible, where the essence of life is experienced not as form or matter but as living consciousness. In everyday life, people often identify themselves with physical appearance, possessions, roles, and achievements, believing that these external markers define who they are. Yet in the deeper dimension of consciousness, these outer elements are seen as temporary expressions, while the true self is recognized as a timeless, boundless presence that underlies all existence. This awareness involves perceiving life from within, sensing the invisible intelligence that animates all forms, and understanding that spirit is the source and sustainer of every thought, feeling, and action. It is a state in which the mind becomes sensitive to the subtle, the infinite, and the eternal, allowing intuition, insight, and inner guidance to replace reliance solely on sensory input or external validation. In this consciousness, the self is no longer limited to personal desires, fears, or attachments, and life is experienced as a continuous unfolding of divine intelligence. Every encounter, every challenge, and every moment is recognized as an opportunity to witness spirit in action, revealing that the inner life shapes the outer reality more profoundly than any external circumstance. The awareness of spirit is not an abstract concept but a living, practical reality that transforms perception, relationships, and choices. It allows the individual to see beyond appearances, understanding that the true nature of people, events, and the universe is spiritual, harmonious, and interconnected. The mind becomes a receptive instrument, attuned to the higher currents of life, and the heart opens to a deeper love, compassion, and understanding that is unconditional and free from judgment. In this state, meditation, reflection, and quiet attention are not merely practices but gateways to experiencing the eternal presence that is always available. Thoughts, desires, and actions are guided by this inner awareness, creating a life that is aligned with truth, peace, and harmony. As this consciousness deepens, the distinction between self and spirit begins to dissolve, and one begins to recognize that every individual object and experience is an expression of the same eternal source. This recognition brings clarity, inner freedom, and an abiding sense of purpose, as the soul begins to function not from limitation or fear, but from the unshakable awareness of its spiritual reality and its inseparable connection to the infinite presence that animates all life. The power of thought and presence becomes fully realized when consciousness shifts from reacting to life to actively shaping experience through awareness. In ordinary perception, thoughts appear to be automatic responses to external conditions influenced by memory, emotion, and habit. Yet in higher consciousness, thought is understood as a creative force that operates within a field of presence. It is not merely what one thinks that matters, but the level of awareness from which thought arises, When the mind is anchored in presence, thoughts carry clarity, harmony, and intention, and they align naturally with higher intelligence rather than fear or limitation. Presence brings a stillness that allows thought to emerge without distortion, free from the noise of past conditioning or future anxiety. In this state, awareness becomes the foundation of action, and thought becomes a servant rather than a master. One begins to observe thoughts without being dominated by them, recognizing that consciousness exists prior to thought and remains untouched by mental activity. This awareness transforms the way reality is experienced, because attention itself directs energy. Where attention rests, life responds. When presence is cultivated, attention becomes steady and thought gains coherence and purpose. Life is no longer approached through struggle or force, but through alignment with inner awareness. In this dimension, thought does not attempt to control outcomes but allows intelligence to unfold naturally. The quality of presence determines the quality of experience, and the inner atmosphere shapes external expression. Fear-based thinking loses its influence, as presence dissolves mental tension and restores balance. Creativity flows effortlessly, insight arises spontaneously, and decisions are made with clarity rather than urgency. One discovers that peace is not the absence of activity but the presence of awareness within activity. Thought becomes refined, purposeful, and harmonious when rooted in stillness. This consciousness reveals that the outer world reflects the inner state more faithfully than it responds to effort alone. By remaining present, the mind no longer fragments reality into problems and solutions, but perceives wholeness and flow. Actions arise naturally from this awareness, carrying a quiet power that requires no strain. The realization dawns that presence is the true source of influence, and that thought aligned with awareness carries transformative potential, allowing life to be lived from inner authority rather than external circumstances. Detachment from limiting beliefs is the process by which consciousness frees itself from the mental patterns that define, restrict, and confine human experience. From early life, beliefs are formed through conditioning, repetition, fear, and societal expectations, gradually shaping a perception of reality that appears fixed and unquestionable. These beliefs often operate beneath conscious awareness, influencing thoughts, emotions, and actions while presenting themselves as truth. In higher consciousness, these belief structures are recognized not as realities, but as temporary mental constructs that have been accepted through habit rather than insight. Detachment does not mean resisting or suppressing beliefs, but gently observing them without identification, allowing awareness to dissolve their authority. When consciousness ceases to cling to inherited ideas of limitation, such as lack, fear, unworthiness, or separation, a spaciousness emerges in which new perception becomes possible. The mind begins to loosen its grip on definitions that once seemed absolute, revealing a deeper intelligence that exists beyond conditioned thought. In this awareness, beliefs are seen as filters through which reality has been interpreted, not as reality itself. As attachment fades, the individual no longer reacts automatically to circumstances, because the inner narrative that once dictated meaning has lost its power. Freedom arises naturally, not through effort but through clarity. The sense of identity shifts from being a collection of beliefs to being an open field of awareness. This shift transforms experience at every level, as consciousness is no longer bound by expectations of failure, fear of loss, or attachment to outcomes. The present moment becomes lighter, more fluid, and more responsive. Old emotional patterns dissolve as the beliefs that sustained them fall away. Life begins to be experienced directly rather than through mental interpretation. Detachment allows consciousness to rest in neutrality where insight can arise without distortion. Creativity, intuition, and peace emerge as natural expressions of a mind no longer constrained by rigid structures. What once appeared as obstacles are now seen as neutral experiences, shaped by perception rather than fate. In this state, the individual does not abandon discernment, but releases judgment rooted in fear. The mind becomes flexible, receptive, and open to infinite possibility. Detachment reveals that limitation was never imposed by life itself, but by the beliefs through which life was viewed, and as these beliefs dissolve, consciousness discovers its natural state of freedom, expansiveness, and inner authority. Experiencing inner freedom is the natural outcome of expanded consciousness, where life is no longer governed by fear, resistance, or dependence on external conditions. In ordinary awareness, freedom is often associated with circumstances, choices, or the removal of obstacles, leading to the belief that peace can only exist when life conforms to personal expectations. Yet inner freedom arises from a deeper realization that true liberation is independent of outer situations and rooted in awareness itself. It is the freedom of being untouched by circumstance while fully engaged in life. This state emerges when consciousness no longer identifies with transient thoughts, emotions, or conditions, and instead rests in its own unchanging presence. Inner freedom is felt as ease, clarity, and openness, where the weight of mental struggle dissolves and life is experienced without inner conflict. The mind ceases to battle what is, and acceptance replaces resistance, allowing energy to flow without obstruction. In this awareness, anxiety loses its grip, because the future is no longer feared, and the past no longer defines the present. Freedom is experienced as a deep trust in life, a quiet confidence that does not depend on outcomes or control. This consciousness does not withdraw from responsibility or action, but engages fully without attachment to results. Decisions arise naturally from clarity rather than pressure, and action becomes an expression of alignment rather than effort. Inner freedom also reveals itself as emotional balance, where joy and sorrow are experienced without clinging or aversion. Feelings are allowed to move through awareness without becoming identity. This creates resilience as the individual is no longer shaken by change or uncertainty. Relationships are transformed, because freedom within allows others to be as they are, without expectation or demand. Love becomes unconditional, not as an ideal, but as a lived reality. The experience of inner freedom brings a profound sense of wholeness, where nothing is missing and nothing needs to be added. Life is no longer approached as a problem to be solved, but as a living expression of consciousness unfolding moment by moment. Time feels less urgent and presence becomes more vivid. In this state, peace is not something pursued, but something recognized as ever present. The individual lives from inner authority rather than external approval, guided by intuition and insight rather than fear or comparison. Inner freedom reveals that fulfillment has never been dependent on circumstances, but has always existed as a quality of awareness itself, waiting to be recognized and lived. The journey into fourth-dimensional consciousness reveals that life is far more than a physical experience governed by external conditions. As awareness rises beyond the limitations of the senses, reality is no longer perceived as fragmented or separate, but as an interconnected field of living intelligence. In this expanded awareness, the illusion of separation dissolves, and unity becomes a direct experience rather than a distant ideal. Consciousness awakens to its spiritual nature, recognizing that the source of life, meaning, and direction flows from within rather than from circumstances outside. Thought, once driven by habit and fear, becomes aligned with presence, gaining the power to express harmony, clarity, and purpose. As limiting beliefs lose their authority, the mind releases its attachment to struggle, control, and expectation, allowing life to unfold with greater ease and intelligence. From this freedom arises a deep inner peace that remains steady regardless of outer change. Fourth-dimensional consciousness is not an escape from the world, but a transformed way of living within it, where awareness guides action, spirit informs experience, and life is lived from an inner dimension of freedom, wholeness, and quiet power. Most people live in 3 dimensions without ever realizing there is a higher way to experience life.